For 40 years, the old shoemaker at the end of the winding cobblestone lane lived in what appeared to be absolute poverty. He owned nothing but the threadbare clothes on his back and a set of rusted, heavy iron tools. Yet everyone who passed his crooked, frost-covered window swore he possessed a hidden treasure, a secret chest of unimaginable wealth that kept him smiling through the bitterest, darkest winters, until the day a wealthy, miserable young man decided to break into his shop and steal it from him. Hello, my dear ones. Come closer to the fire, settle into your favorite chair, and let the warmth of the hearth chase away the chill of the evening. If you enjoy stories that warm the heart and leave you with a valuable lesson, subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales and become part of our storytelling family. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading every comment. Our story begins in the sleepy, snow-draped village of Oakhaven. It was a place where winters were long and harsh, and the wind howled through the valley like a hungry wolf. At the very edge of this village stood a small, leaning cottage that smelled constantly of rich beeswax, old leather, and strong peppermint tea. This was the home and workshop of Elias. Elias was an old man, his face mapped with 1,000 deep wrinkles, each one earned through a lifetime of quiet labor. His hands were thick, calloused, and permanently stained with dark boot polish. He had no wife, no children, and no grand estate. To the casual observer, Elias had absolutely nothing. But if you looked closely at Elias, you would see something quite extraordinary. You would see a light in his eyes that danced brighter than the flames in my fireplace. You would hear him humming a gentle, joyful tune as he hammered soles and stitched leather. He greeted every passing villager with a smile so genuine and warm that it could melt the frost right off their scarves. He was, without a doubt, the happiest man in Oakhaven. Across the village square lived a young man named Julian. Julian was the only son of the town's wealthiest merchant. He lived in a towering stone mansion with velvet curtains, roaring fires in every room, and tables that groaned under the weight of roasted meats and sweet pastries. Julian had everything money could buy. He wore coats lined with fine fur and boots made of the softest calfskin imported from faraway lands. Yet, despite his mountains of gold and endless comforts, Julian was deeply, profoundly miserable. He walked through the village with a heavy scowl, his shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of his own discontent. He trusted no one. He believed that everyone only wanted his money, and he guarded his family's wealth with a fierce, bitter jealousy. Julian could not understand how a man like Elias, who ate stale bread and wore a patched coat, could possess such radiant joy. It defied all logic. Julian became obsessed with the old shoemaker. He convinced himself that Elias was hiding something: a map, a jewel, a secret hoard of gold buried beneath the floorboards of that wretched little shop. How else could a man with nothing be so endlessly happy? One frigid Tuesday evening, when the moon was hidden behind thick gray snow clouds, Julian decided he could not take the mystery any longer. He wrapped his dark woolen cloak tightly around his shoulders and crept through the silent, sleeping village. The snow crunched softly beneath his heavy boots. He arrived at the shoemaker's cottage and peered through a crack in the wooden shutters. The wind bit at Julian's cheeks, but he stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the scene inside. To his astonishment, Elias was not asleep. The old man was sitting at his worn wooden workbench, bathed in the flickering golden light of a single tallow candle. But he wasn't counting gold coins or polishing a hidden diamond. He was working. But he was not working on the sturdy, practical boots he usually repaired for the farmers. Elias was holding a tiny, delicate piece of vibrant red leather. With agonizing care, his old, trembling hands were stitching together the most beautiful pair of little shoes Julian had ever seen. They were lined with soft white fleece and embroidered with tiny silver thread. Julian watched for hours. He watched as the candle burned down to a stub. He watched as Elias winced, rubbing his aching back and stretching his cramped, arthritic fingers. Why was he working so late? Who were those magnificent shoes for? Julian knew there were no wealthy children in Oakhaven whose parents could afford such a masterpiece. The next night, Julian returned. Again, he stood in the freezing cold, peering through the crack in the shutter. This time, Elias was carefully wrapping the tiny red shoes in a piece of clean brown paper. He tied it with a simple piece of twine. Then the old man stood up, wrapped his thin, ragged scarf around his neck, and picked up his walking stick. Julian quickly ducked behind a stack of firewood as the cottage door creaked open. Elias stepped out into the blizzard. The wind whipped his thin coat, but the old man pressed forward, holding the brown paper package tightly against his chest. Julian followed him, keeping to the shadows. The cold was piercing, slicing through even Julian's fine fur coat, but his curiosity burned hotter than the winter chill. Elias walked past the wealthy homes. He walked past the baker's warm shop and the blacksmith's forge. He kept walking until he reached the poorest, most broken-down part of the village. He stopped in front of a small, drafty shack where the widow Clara lived with her crippled little girl, Elara. Julian held his breath, watching from behind a snowdrift. Elias crept quietly to the front step of the shack. He gently placed the brown paper package on the wooden porch. He knocked on the door 3 times, a sharp, quick rhythm, and then he hurried away as fast as his old legs could carry him, hiding himself in the shadows of a nearby alley. Julian watched as the door slowly opened. The widow Clara peered out, her face drawn and tired. She looked down and saw the package. When she opened it and saw the magnificent red shoes, a gasp escaped her lips. She fell to her knees in the snow, clutching the shoes to her chest, tears streaming down her freezing cheeks. "An angel," Julian heard her whisper into the dark night. "An angel has visited us." Julian looked over at the alley where Elias was hiding. The old shoemaker was watching the widow. And in that moment, the moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating Elias's face. He was smiling. It was a smile of such pure, overwhelming radiance that it made Julian's chest ache. It was a look of complete, absolute peace. Elias had received no money. He had received no praise. He had lost sleep, endured pain, and given away his finest materials. Yet he looked richer than any king Julian had ever read about. The next morning, as the village woke to a fresh blanket of white snow, Julian marched right up to the shoemaker's door and pushed it open. The little bell above the door jingled wildly. Elias looked up from his workbench, a warm, welcoming smile spreading across his wrinkled face. "Ah, young Master Julian," Elias said, his voice like the rustle of dry autumn leaves. Come in, sit by the stove. You look like you've been standing in the cold for 3 nights." Julian froze, his heart hammered in his chest. "You knew I was watching you?" Elias chuckled softly, returning to his work. My eyes may be old, son, but they are not blind. I saw your shadow by the woodpile. Tell me, what is it that a rich young man wants with an old, dusty shoemaker?" Julian stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. "I want to know your secret. I have a house full of treasures. I can eat a feast every day. I can buy anything in this world. But I can't sleep at night. My heart feels like a lump of lead. And you have nothing. You give away your best work for free in the middle of the night. You are a fool, Elias, a complete fool. Yet you smile like you own the world. Tell me what your secret is. I will pay you anything." Elias stopped his hammering. He laid his tools down on the scarred wooden bench and looked deeply into Julian's angry, desperate eyes. He didn't look insulted. He looked upon the young man with deep, profound pity and kindness. "My dear boy," Elias said softly, "you cannot buy my secret. But if you are truly willing to learn, I can show it to you." Julian swallowed hard, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a strange, quiet hope. "Show me. What do I have to do?" Elias patted the empty wooden stool beside him. "Take off your fine fur coat, roll up your silk sleeves, and sit down." If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these stories reach more people who need a little inspiration today. Julian hesitated. He had never worked a day in his life. His hands were soft and pale, but the desperation in his soul pushed him forward. He took off his expensive coat, draped it over a dusty chair, rolled up his sleeves, and sat beside the old man. Elias handed him a sharp awl, a thick needle, and a piece of tough, unyielding cowhide. "Today we are making a pair of sturdy winter boots for Thomas, the old postman. His feet have been freezing for weeks, but he is too proud to ask for charity." The work was excruciating. For hours, Julian struggled to push the thick needle through the tough leather. The rough twine bit into his soft palms, raising painful red blisters. The sharp awl slipped, slicing a deep cut across his thumb. He bled, he sweat, and his back throbbed with a dull, heavy ache. By the time the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snowy streets, Julian was exhausted. He wanted to quit. He wanted to throw the leather across the room and run back to his mansion, to his soft bed and his warm fires. But then he looked over at Elias. The old man's hands were bleeding too, yet he continued to work, humming his quiet, joyful tune. Julian wiped the sweat from his forehead, gritted his teeth, and kept stitching. It took them 3 long, agonizing days to finish the boots. When they were finally done, they were not beautiful. They were a little lopsided, and the stitching was clumsy where Julian had struggled. But they were thick, waterproof, and warm. They were exactly what the old postman needed. "Now," Elias said, his voice raspy with exhaustion, "tonight we deliver them." Just past midnight, Julian and Elias crept through the silent village. The cold was bitter, biting at Julian's nose and ears. They reached the postman's small cottage. Julian's heart began to race. He carefully placed the boots on the stoop, knocked on the door, and ran back to hide in the bushes beside Elias. The postman opened the door, a candle shaking in his frail hand. When he saw the thick, warm boots, he dropped to his knees. He ran his hands over the clumsy stitching, tears welling up in his tired eyes. He looked up at the starry sky and whispered a prayer of profound gratitude. In the bushes, Julian felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation rising in his chest. It started as a tiny spark in his stomach, a warmth that defied the freezing night air. The spark grew, blooming into a powerful, glowing fire that rushed through his veins. For the first time in his entire life, Julian felt a true, pure, unselfish joy. It was a feeling so massive, so beautiful, that tears pricked the corners of his eyes. He looked at Elias, and the old man simply nodded, patting Julian's shoulder. From that day on, Julian's life changed. He didn't abandon his father's mansion, but he spent every spare moment in the dusty little shoe shop. He learned how to measure, how to cut, how to stitch. They made shoes for the orphans, boots for the farmers whose crops had failed, and warm slippers for the elderly. They worked in secret, taking no credit, asking for no praise. And with every pair of shoes he gave away, the heavy lead in Julian's heart grew lighter. He began to smile. He began to laugh. The townspeople noticed the change in the wealthy merchant's son, but none knew the reason why. But winter in Oakhaven was cruel, and time is the one thing no amount of kindness can stop. As the days grew shorter and the snow piled higher, Elias began to slow down. His cough, which had always been a quiet rattle, grew deep and heavy. His hands shook so badly he could barely thread a needle. One morning, Julian arrived at the shop to find the fire cold and Elias lying in his small bed in the back room, pale and gasping for breath. "Elias!" Julian cried, rushing to the old man's side. He grabbed Elias's cold, calloused hands. "I'll fetch the doctor. I'll pay him any amount of gold. I'll bring you the finest medicines from the city." Elias weakly shook his head, offering a faint, trembling smile. "No, my boy. My time here is done. My hands have stitched their last seam. My heart has run its course." "You can't leave me," Julian pleaded, tears openly falling down his face. "I still have so much to learn. Who will make the shoes for the poor? Who will teach me how to be happy?" Elias reached up with a trembling hand and brushed a tear from Julian's cheek. "You already know the secret, Julian. You discovered it the night we made the boots for the postman. You just need to remember it." Elias's breathing grew shallow. His eyes searched Julian's face. "There is one last pair, Julian, over there, on the bench." Julian looked over. Sitting on the workbench was a pair of delicate, beautifully crafted black shoes, small enough for a child. "For little Timothy," Elias whispered, his voice barely a breath. "The baker's son. He is singing in the winter choir tomorrow. He needs nice shoes to stand on the cold stone floor of the church. I started them, but I cannot finish them. You must finish them, Julian. You must deliver them." "I will," Julian promised, his voice breaking. "I promise you, I will." Elias smiled, that same radiant, peaceful smile that had first captured Julian's attention. He closed his eyes, let out a long, quiet sigh, and the greatest shoemaker Oakhaven had ever known was gone. Julian sat by his friend's side for a long time, the silence of the room pressing heavy on his soul. He wanted to weep. He wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. But he looked at the unfinished shoes on the bench. He remembered his promise. Julian stood up. He wiped his face. He lit the fire, pulled up the worn wooden stool, and picked up Elias's tools. His hands were steadier now. He worked through the night, pouring all his grief, all his love, and all his gratitude into every single stitch. When the morning sun finally broke over the snowy hills, casting a pale pink light through the frosted window, the shoes were finished. They were perfect. That day, the village of Oakhaven mourned. The news of Elias's passing spread quickly. People gathered in the square, sharing quiet stories of the old man's gentle smile and kind greetings. But as the town prepared for the evening winter choir service, a profound realization began to ripple through the community. Little Timothy, the baker's son, arrived at the church wearing a brand new, beautifully stitched pair of black shoes. The widow Clara noticed them. She looked down at her daughter's tiny red shoes. Then she looked at the postman, who was standing tall in his sturdy winter boots. Slowly, one by one, the people of Oakhaven looked down at their feet. The farmer who had lost his crops, the elderly woman who lived alone, the orphans who sat in the front pew. Nearly half the village was wearing shoes that had mysteriously appeared on their doorsteps in the middle of the night. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the church. They had all thought it was an angel. They had all thought it was a miracle from the heavens. They had never once suspected the poorest man in the village, the man who wore a patched coat and ate stale bread. Julian stood in the back of the church, watching the realization dawn on the townspeople. He saw the tears spring to their eyes. He heard the quiet gasps of awe and heartbreak. They finally understood the wealth of Elias the shoemaker. He hadn't hoarded gold beneath his floorboards. He had poured his treasure into the very soles of their feet, protecting them, warming them, lifting them up. Julian didn't return to his father's mansion that night. He went back to the dusty little shop at the end of the cobblestone lane. He swept the floor. He organized the threads. He stoked the fire until it roared bright and warm. And the next morning, when the villagers walked past the crooked window, they saw the young, wealthy merchant's son sitting at the worn wooden bench, an apron tied around his waist, humming a quiet, gentle tune as he hammered a piece of tough leather. Julian never became a rich merchant like his father. He gave away his inheritance to build a school for the village children. He lived a simple life in that leaning cottage, his hands permanently stained with dark boot polish, his fingers calloused and scarred. But if you looked closely at Julian, as he greeted every passing villager with a warm, genuine smile, you would see a light in his eyes that danced brighter than any diamond. He had discovered the old shoemaker's secret, and it was a treasure he guarded fiercely by giving it away every single day. You see, my dear friends, Julian learned that true wealth is never measured by what we can gather in our pockets or lock inside a heavy iron vault. The heaviest vaults can be broken, and the deepest pockets can tear. True wealth, the kind that lets you sleep peacefully through the darkest nights and smile through the bitterest winters, is measured entirely by what we give away. When we pour our time, our energy, and our love into easing the burdens of others, we stitch together a soul that can weather any storm. And that, my dear friends, is why a kind heart is worth more than all the gold in the world. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Nanny Granny's Golden Tales for more timeless tales and endless wisdom. And tell me in the comments, what lesson did you learn from today's story?